Could we go to war with China at the same time as war with Ukraine continues to drag on? In this video, we'll be covering the potential warning that we just received from a US military general that we may be at war with China within the next 2 years. We'll also cover the madness that's going on in Ukraine, including strategies, as well as a potential lack of recruits for not just Ukraine, but also for Russia. And what is Russia doing to fill the void? What does it have to do with prisoners and convicts? Let's get started. Remember though, today is January 30th, which means the coupon code on Building Your Wealth expires today. Check that out via the link down below. You get lifetime access. So anytime we add new content, you get access to it. You want to ask me Q&A directly in the courses. We do so every morning. The market is open. And in the Elite Hustler live streams, we do those on the weekend. Look forward to seeing you there. So China and Taiwan. Now we have a former Army General, Michael Minihan, who's come out and suggested that we could see war within 2 years between Taiwan and China, and that could end up dragging the United States into battle to help defend Taiwan versus China. The individual says that my gut tells me we will fight in 2025, he wrote in a memo to staff. A U.S. representative replied to this and agreed with the assessment, unfortunately. This was Michael McCall, who suggests that China is looking to ultimately take control of Taiwan. Of course, some other individuals in the House of Representatives replied to this and thought it was absolutely ridiculous that China would end up invading Taiwan, that China has become, yes, a style of authoritarian and communist regime, but much more capitalistic, but very different from the United States in that we are all about individual capitalism. China is all about national capitalism. And the last thing they'd want to do is crush their economy even more with a war. But that doesn't change General Minihan's or Mr. McCall, Congressman McCall's opinion that China strongly believes in the one China policy. Now remember, that's not to be confused with the old and now removed one child policy, which probably helped China ultimately lead to a declining population or receive a declining population and a declining birth rate. That policy was removed, but Chinese still aren't having a lot of babies. But anyway, back to the one China policy. The one China policy really argues that there is no difference between Taiwan and China, that they are a unified China. Of course, Taiwan sees itself as an independent democracy or republic. And China has warned that Kevin McCarthy should absolutely not repeat the same mistake of Nancy Pelosi by visiting Taiwan. Remember that in August, between August 2nd and August 3rd, Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. It's the first leader of her closeness to the presidency, just 3 seats away from the presidency, to visit Taiwan in decades. And this led Beijing to launch pretty large-scale military exercises with missiles landing in Japanese and Taiwanese water. McCarthy did promise to make a trip to Taiwan of his own if he became Speaker of the House. Now, obviously, he's Speaker of the House. Taiwan is one of the 4 Asian tigers, also known as the 4 little dragons. Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea. These 4 are essentially regions that have become highly globalized and highly innovative and are leading to a lot of capitalistic growth in the Asia-Pacific region. But it's worth noting there's still some pretty big ties between Taiwan and China. You've got 42% of Taiwan's exports still going to China. And guess what? Most of those are optical equipment like mirrors and lenses, which well, both of those are very important in semiconductor equipment, and semiconductor equipment itself. China obviously wanting to expand its own semiconductor supply chain substantially. Their big bet is on the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Trade Corporation, which is a competitor to TSMC. However, China still heavily relies on TSMC, and that is why Taiwan exports about 42% of its exports to China, or at least in part of the reason why. Taiwan also imports 22% of all of its imports from China. This is different from the United States, who just sends about 15% of its exports to China, and 10% of our imports come from China. So Representative McCall ultimately warns that China is going to be strategic with how it might end up wanting to invade Taiwan, in that they'll probably wait until after the 2024 elections. That will give them an opportunity to potentially influence Taiwan's elections in 2024. And if the influencing campaign in those elections fails, then they might end up looking at a military invasion. Colonel Douglas McGregor believes this is unlikely. He is a retired U.S. Army colonel. He was very active during the Gulf War. He actually suggests that the issue so much isn't China and Taiwan. It's actually Russia and Ukraine. And that's because Russia is, according to him, holding up a lot better than individuals and countries had hoped. Russia has found ways to work around sanctions. If anything, they've made it easier for China and India to get access to cheaper oil and to become substantially stronger competitors to the United States. Ukraine is ultimately facing a potential lack of fighting aged and fighting capable individuals, having lost already as many as 150,000 people confirmed dead, with another 35,000 individuals missing in action and believed to be dead. By some estimates that, there are some estimates that 7 years of Javelin production have basically already disappeared in the war between Ukraine and Russia. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, whose earnings reports I went through last week, and who partnered to make Javelins, for example, faced years of order backlogs before the war, and now those order backlogs are even worse. So in a weird way, we like to think that, a military-industrial complex, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon profiting bigly off the war. Well, they actually haven't really been able to increase their production that substantially, and what they're really doing is just adding more and more and more backlog to what they end up needing to produce over the next decade. However, it's probably going to be great business for them through 2030, really, especially as a lot of countries like even Spain, Canada, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands are all on the same page of now potentially sending not just armored personnel carriers, but also tanks, maybe even F-16s to Ukraine. And really what they're doing is they're depleting their own stockpile, sending that to Ukraine, the front lines, so to speak, and then they'll just place new orders for brand new stuff that they'll eventually get when Lockheed and Raytheon and the other military machines are capable of actually producing these products. Now, Colonel Douglas McGregor is very concerned about the war with Ukraine and does not indicate that it's anywhere near being finished, unfortunately. This comes at the same time as a Financial Times piece actually gave a little bit of light to what Russia is doing to make sure it continues to have a competitive army. I was a little bit blown away by this, on one hand. On the other hand, it also somewhat makes sense. But apparently Russia is now authorizing mercenary businesses like the Wagner Group in Russia to hire pardoned criminals to fight in Ukraine. The Wagner Group is a paramilitary group, essentially a paid contractor to help fight in Ukraine. And basically, the only person who has the power to pardon individuals in Russia is Putin. Of course, he can assign other people to do that pardoning. And the expectation is they're pardoning tens of thousands of criminals, armed robbers, murderers, you name it, to go fight in Ukraine. Dmitry Peskov, a spokesperson for Putin, actually ended up praising a convicted armed robber who was recruited by the Wagner Group for heroism in his fighting in Ukraine. And Putin himself awarded that individual, that former prisoner, armed robber, a medal on New Year's Eve, while also forgiving the rest of his sentence. He had already served 7 years for his armed robbery, and now he's a war hero. Apparently, Russia is also now continuing this practice, despite the United States and other groups labeling these mercenary groups as transnational criminal organizations. The goal of these labels is obviously to limit their international reach, to limit their ability to conduct business, to limit their access to banking and finance. And the U.S. is straight up basically sanctioning these companies. The United Kingdom is actually estimating that the number of prisoners so far recruited to fight for Wagner, just one of the companies in Ukraine, has reached 50,000. Russia is apparently also now taking in former convicts and former chefs to end up becoming leaders in the offensive by Russia against Ukraine. Basically, hey, who can we get to fight? This comes at the same time as, unfortunately, Ukraine was embarrassed for a scandal over graft. This is essentially it was really all tipped off by this guy named Yuri Nikolov. He tipped off the Ministry of Defense about crazy prices for catering on things like just regular battlefield rations, whether those are crackers or dried fruits or whatever. And he exposed insane pricing that Ukraine was being charged and billed for this military food. Apparently, there was a $350 million deal with a catering company, and they were charging wildly inflated prices. Ukrainians themselves are pissed off because they personally, not talking about tax money here, personally have donated around $500 million of their own money to help fund the war in Ukraine. And now apparently, at the same time as Ukraine is internationally asking for money and weapons, what you actually have are these exposés coming out of substantial government corruption over where the money is going and being spent. This has led to the sacking of numerous different government officials. One chief of staff from Zelensky fired or resigned. 5 governors of frontline provinces fired or resigned. 4 deputy ministers fired or resigned. 2 members of the president's ruling savant of the People Party, this is a group in parliament, resigned or fired. A lot of finger pointing going on, a lot of new anti-graft policies, anti-corruption courts being created. The European Commission is suggesting they're investigating this and we're trying to work with Zelensky on resolving the issues. Zelensky came into power in 2019, kind of ironically promised to end tensions with Russia, and now we're actually at war with Russia. So a lot of pain going on between Russia and Ukraine, and a lot of stretching going on both sides. And this is the kind of stuff that happens in war, but corruption is not going to be something very, very popular, especially when the United States is sending nearly $100 billion of economic aid and military aid to Ukraine. For example, tanks, which might not arrive for several months. 31 tanks from the United States, Abrams tanks, these are actual fighting tanks, not just armored personnel carriers, are going straight from the manufacturer to Ukraine. In the meantime, 2 battalions of Leopards and British Challengers, a total of about 100 tanks, are also going to Ukraine. We're expecting to get the first wave of about 40 Leopards in about 3 months, puts us at about April. A second batch later on. We mentioned earlier, but to reiterate, Spain, Canada, Portugal, the Netherlands, Finland, everyone is really chipping in here to contribute, and it allows them to give away sort of their older equipment and buy new equipment themselves. However, tanks are not the easiest because not only do you need to know how to actually operate the vehicle, but now you need to be proficient enough to operate that vehicle while potentially under fire and in a battlefield. And this could take 5 to 6 weeks of just basic training and tactical training to learn how to actually integrate tanks, armored personnel carriers, javelins, howitzers, all together. Now, the potential plan is that Ukraine might be able to attack from the north and cut off Russia's north-south supply routes. This would be by going in through the Luhansk province. And essentially limit the flow of Russians and limit the supply of Russians to the southeast. Another option is going south more towards trying to destroy Russia's supply chains, essentially, between Russia and Crimea. The problem is you have a lot of open territory here. Open territory is really tough because it makes it very difficult to move troops and supplies forward, because all it takes is a Russian trench to take out your moving troops. this is actually where tanks and armored personnel carriers end up becoming huge, not only for reconnaissance, but actually being able to take substantial swaths of land, move forward, and pressure Russia. It's a very D-Day-esque style of potential scenario that Ukraine needs to pull off. Estimates are that you would need 3 times as many attackers to be able to break through a Russian defensive line and potentially control it. That would be in an effort to obviously overwhelm the Russians. So again, Ukraine's getting about 31 Abrams, about 100 tanks from Europe. You've got this belief that China and Taiwan, on one hand, could potentially go to war within 2 years, and at the same time, war with Russia in Ukraine is unfortunately nowhere really near finished, as much as there is hope that the arrival of the tanks will help. The lack of manpower and the continued raising of manpower in Russia continues to create nervousness, especially since in August, September, Russia recruited about 300,000 more service members, but only 150,000 of them have been deployed so far. Another 150,000 have been held back and are prepared for future deployment. Yikes. A lot of pain going on between China and Ukraine, and these are going to be massive geopolitical issues we'll have to pay attention to. Now, don't forget, today is January 30th, so check out those programs on Building Your Wealth, link down below. Get the best price guaranteed going forward, and get lifetime access to all of the content, trading challenges, buy-sell alerts, course member live streams by joining any of the programs linked down below.